Okay, it looks like we're recording now. This is the fourth episode, I believe.
Correct.
Good. And we were going to talk about a few things. I think the first thing we were going to look at was Manifold, the content management system that we're using to sort of aggregate the project together. And so we've been poking around with it. It looks like there's different ways to present different kinds of content. Let me see, I can probably just share here. No, potentially not. And there it is. Okay.
There we go.
So there's different ways to present content there. One thing, however, is it does look like potentially on the back end, on the administration, it can be a little. There are limitations in terms of presentation.
Yeah.
So things like you have these sorting features when you're viewing, but as an administrator, there doesn't seem to necessarily be a way to set a default view order for things like these video resources, that kind of thing, unless I'm overlooking it.
Yeah, it seems to just collect them under resources.
Mm-hmm. But now you mentioned we may not be using the most recent version.
Yeah, we're on version 2, and there is a version 3. And I learned about this because I was trying to basically have it so that the text we have that introduces the project is not overlaid on top of that image. It makes the text kind of hard to read in spots.
I think it's clipped too. I think it maybe cut short.
Yeah.
Maybe not.
And it looked as if in the help pages you could adjust the blocks, and the blocks are only available for the next version, and that does appear to give you more control in terms of how you arrange the content. More making the back end look more like you're designing kind of a basic web page. Mm-hmm. So I think that kind of functionality gives you a better sense of how you can organize things. But that seemed to be just how you'd organize the landing page. I don't know what it offers in terms of how you'd start arranging the content. But I'm wondering if you have, basically it uses blocks, that I'm wondering if you could then designate certain blocks as certain content types, and that might give you some control that way. So, mm-hmm. I mean, it's less of an issue now because we've got 2 texts and 3 videos. But I imagine as we start adding more things, and as we start talking through how we want to add or share the resources that we're using, so as we read things and things like that, I'm hoping it becomes more of an issue, that essentially we get to a point where we've got more stuff than we are able to make sense of.
Yeah, and we'll look at some of that today because one of the things is we're starting to accumulate a lot of things like PDF reading materials, links to work, and so we need to kind of figure out how to aggregate that together in the main project page in a way that's accessible, and useful and collaborative. So we have the potential maybe then to upgrade. That's probably something we'd have to talk to the publisher about, since it looks like this is going through their university sponsor, essentially.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's something to look at. Let me, in fact, segue into that. Let me share that. It's this page. Right, so right now we have sort of a back end of materials that are being accumulated in a Google Drive, and we'll want to fold these into the CMS manifold. And then, eventually going forward, we'd skip this repository completely and just be using the manifold site as the repository. Right now, because we've just sort of gotten our feet wet with that, we still have a bunch of other materials kind of floating in the ether. And this, is precisely the kind of thing we want to work with, right? I mean, how do these things kind of coalesce? How can we use machines, or how can machines be partners in generating work, right?
Yeah, that's in part because, you know, with I think any kind of academic project, and depending on how you work, and you and I work similarly, right? Just the beginning part is kind of just a grab bag of stuff, and then you get to a point where figuring out, you know, I mean, if you pull up if you could click on the mturk notes, I think that's the file that then has all of the links that you have accumulated.
Right.
You can start to see how, and a lot of these are short news items, but, you know, how does something like this list of resources become usable in some way?
That's my dog. You must see the FedEx man. Right. I mean, we work similarly. Hold on just 1 second here.
Oh, vamp. Well, Jeremy's away taking care of his dog. Yeah, we just have lots of links. And some of them are things that we knew about before that kind of piqued our interest, but a lot of these are just things that get thrown together, and that kind of form the background of a project. So, you know, a lot of the things that are listed here are things that might necessarily inform how we approach it, but they might not necessarily become things that end up on a reference page or a works cited page. So, you know, we're kind of at the point of the project in terms of, you know, we're still thinking around the kind of object that we're interested in. And so a lot of these sources are help with that kind of work. They're sort of helping us formulate what we think the issue is and how it might speak to people. Because obviously there's lots of, as sort of Jeremy scrolls through here, these sort of basic headings, right? There's overview, characteristics. Like, these are general categories we're using to help understand how these things might pan out, but also, given our interest in terms of as is up on the manifold page, our sort of cobbled together methodology, that to a certain extent what we want to do is sort of avoid at the outset kind of knowing what these categories of human and non-human intelligence might be. To a certain extent, right? We want Mechanical Turks to tell us what's what. Yeah.
And in fact, and I was noticing we work similarly, yet differently enough to be an issue, right? Because that is to say, so like, as you point out, I mean, I started to accumulate a lot of these links here. You were adding a bunch of PDFs, and we were just sort of talking about, you know, how do we wrangle these together, right? Because you know, as you say, I'm starting to form these categories, but, you know, then I'm unaware of, you know, what are the PDFs and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
We talked about even potentially, since we are working with Mechanical Turk, and as you say, we've got a lot of these notes, and what's useful about this is a lot of these things probably won't end up in a finished product. Right?
No.
I mean, you're probably not going to cite a lot of this, because a lot of these, because if you look at them, a lot of them are just kind of background information that are useful in the aggregate, right?
Right.
Talking about how Mechanical Turk labor can be seen as economic exploitation in particular ways. Here are a bunch of different resources about how Mechanical Turk is used in different forms of research, right? So you'll see things here about here's things about using Mechanical Turk as a human subjects pool versus other sources. But, you know, how many of these are actually going to end up in a finished product is questionable, but they're still very meaningful for framing the issue and potentially for speaking about in the aggregate.
Right.
We did also talk about, since we have this, and one of the things I want to talk about right now, or in this session, was, you know, this list is kind of growing, and certainly as is characteristic for me, and I think as is characteristic for you, sometimes we start to add a lot of these resources, and it gets to a kind of unwieldy point where it's like, I've got all this stuff, but what I need to do is wrangle this all together. I mean, as a mentor once told me, at some point you got to get out of the library, right?
Right.
You can't just keep drawing the circle larger and larger in terms of more and more stuff. You've got to pull it together. And so we were talking about maybe ways to do that, potentially even floating an Amazon Turk hit itself, a job itself.
Yeah.
Where potentially we could post a lot of these materials and have the task, look through and summarize, or even just, here are a bunch of materials, collate these all into, no more than 6 or 7 categories of your choosing.
Yeah.
Or something like that, and potentially using the Turk to see cognitively how it would be assembled, through that method. So it wouldn't be us dictating the terms of this, but allowing it to sort of emerge from the Turk itself.
For pennies on the dollar.
Exactly. That might be an interesting thing to see. How would you have to price that? Because something like that would be, I'm assuming, a sort of higher paid job, because it requires, in material terms, just more time to do.
Yeah.
If you actually have to look through those. And then other things like, I think this resource points out things like the prevalence of bots on Mechanical Turk.
Yeah.
Because I know the complexity of these are really interesting, because if you're a Turker, you want to get through these as fast as you can. And so people have done things like set up bots to simply, if you're doing surveys or classifications, set up bots to do that. And then, as I think your tittering indicates,
yes,
the weirdness here, where a lot of Mechanical Turk jobs are essentially training machine learning algorithms, right?
Right.
So then we use that to set up bots to then do things, to do things like process CAPTCHAs. So we've got bots training machine learning algorithms, and then we're taking the machine learning to make bots. It's almost like there's a closed loop between, inside the Turk, of bots are taking it to train machine learning algorithms, and then machine learning algorithms are being used to assemble bots.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, sorry, go ahead.
No, it's like you play against the Mechanical Turk in chess, knowing how it works, and then you open up the cabinet and it actually is a machine inside.
Right. It's a chess playing robot that's being used to train a chess playing algorithm that is then going into the robot. It's this sort of almost closed loop. We're on the outside saying, well, I'm getting my 7 cents. So
right.
But what's going on there is interesting and meaningful, and I think also helps shape our direction in terms of, we see this, or we often kind of see this as this link here, this notion of robots are not coming for your job, management is. Right. And it sort of argues that saying, well, the machines are coming for our jobs is a calculated way of displacing agency, right? It's not a middle manager saying, well, we're going to have to let you go because a machine can do this more cheaply. It's as though the machine itself is the sole agent saying, well, it's automation, it's taking your job. There are no humans making choices here. But while this is a good point, I think it leans into a binary of agency being zero sum.
Right.
And, it's either a greedy middle manager or it's a soulless, faceless machine. Somebody's making a choice here. And I think that binary can be limiting. Yeah. If we look at what we're really seeing here is a coalition of man, machine, labor laws, conventions, right? We're seeing much more distributed agency, not just, okay, where is the buck stopping, right?
Yeah. Yeah, because to a certain extent, there's also the troubling resonance with the notion of a robot coming for your job that seems to speak a lot to the ways in which migrants are treated in terms of right. There's a weird kind of we need a citizenship policy for robots so that they're not benefiting from our whatever. Anyway, but yeah, no, I think that's our I think at least the thing that we're locked into at this point is that if we're going to understand how this all shapes out, any kind of binary like that is going to be trouble, right? Because to a certain extent, it is right? That the management is coming for your job, but the middle manager is probably not the person that made the robot, right? The robot creates the idea of replacing the person with the robot. So in that sense, right, even if it is the manager making a decision to replace you with the robot, the presence of the robot itself informs that decision, right?
Yeah.
The management's decision to replace everybody with automation isn't a decision that gets made outside the context of automation already existing.
Yeah, and I mean, they're all clearly in a kind of pact because there's no way that act could come to fruition without all the players, right?
Right.
I mean, a middle manager couldn't say, well, I'm going to replace you with magic, right? Because that doesn't,
right.
That wouldn't coalesce unless the capability is there. And there are other, intangible things like competition, right? Well, competitors are doing this. So a real actant here is competitors and
right.
the exigencies that they're leveraging. I mean, if we look at any of these scenarios, we're bound to see a whole bunch of people in a kind of pact, even if some of them aren't super willing.
Right.
I mean, they're still, or perhaps that isn't their primary goal. They're still necessary for the act to emerge.
Yeah. No, that's interesting too, that we've got our base analogy, because that's what Amazon has decided to go with, the mechanical Turk. But there's also and I'm going to get is it Paul Bunyan that has the race with the...
Well, it can't be Paul. Oh, no, you're thinking of John Henry.
That has the race with the machine that chops down trees. Yeah.
Well, John Henry is the steel driving man. So he's racing. He's a figure of man against machine.
Right.
Right. That he can, if I'm not, man, I'm really botching this, but I think it's, it has to do with the railroad, right?
Yes. Was it driving spikes?
I believe so. And boy, and this is really interesting because that also taps into, as you alluded to earlier, ethics of race and agents, who gets to count as a full human and these kinds of things. This, in fact, is coming up because I believe there's a movie about John Henry coming up, and there's questions of who's going to play that part. But anywho, I mean, he's usually a figure of man against machine because he beats the machine, and then that does get modified in terms of but. Is or isn't he destroyed in the process?
It's right? according to legend. Now, of course, there's competing legends that he beat the steam-powered rock drilling machine, a race that he won only to die in victory with hammer in hand as his heart gave out from stress.
Right. I mean, that's often sort of the I don't know, the parable. I don't know what to take from that, but it's like he beats it, but at what cost? Right.
Yeah.
Destroys himself, and potentially there's sort of a narrative there of, can you fight the machine? And if so, do you lose yourself? And
right. Well, I mean, it's interesting sort of counter sort of, I mean, the mechanical Turk is an actual thing. So it's less of a legend, but right. As far as stories go, it's an interesting kind of counter juxtaposition that of course Amazon goes with the mechanical Turk story as its sort of metaphor for this labor, when it could just have easily gone with John Henry, right? Like the fact that it's the mechanical Turk is the machine that we're using to organize our thinking about Turks, as opposed to some other story that gets at the relationship of labor between man and machine, is kind of interesting. Which
none of those.
Which is kind of, I like. I mean, that's all those, and just to touch on it really quickly. I mean, I think that's why I find the cultural technique so interesting to this, that it kind of starts with the cultural technique, right? The media or the medium or whatever, that then gives rise to the concept.
Okay.
So right, the famous example is the difference between the conceptual difference between humans and animals is a function of fences and barn doors, right? You put up a fence for whatever reason, and then and then retroactively, right, it creates the difference between humans and non-humans. So we tend to humanistically read the concept as prior to the technique that gives rise to it. And so I think, right, that's part of the problem with those readings that you were just pulling up, is they tend to want to get at the concept first. But if you actually trace it back to particular techniques that arise in response to particular needs, that those then generate the concepts that retroactively seem to explain where they come from, right? So the person that creates the bot to fill out the psych survey creates that bot so that they can get more hits done. And then subsequently, right, their decision to do that potentially generates some conceptual distinction between human and bot labor.
Yeah.
But it's that particular nest that creates a need, that creates a technique, that generates the concepts, as opposed to the concepts being used to explain what's happening there.
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting because none of those metaphors, I mean, of course, there's always slippage in a metaphor, and none of them are potentially quite precise in terms of the sort of labor that's going on in Mechanical Turk. I mean, one metaphor might be one where, sometimes you hear about when people are laid off, and they'll speak of it in terms of training their replacement, right?
Right.
Because a lot of times the labor on Mechanical Turk is done in order to reduce the labor that will be on Mechanical Turk. Right? You're training a machine algorithm to spot stop signs, so that way we won't need to put more jobs for people to spot different items on Mechanical Turk, right?
Right.
Some of the labor is precisely that, is in a sense, kind of self-defeating or training your own replacement. Anywho, so, I mean, it might be something to consider, as we collect these materials, if it would be worthwhile to float some Mechanical Turk tasks to see what happens there in terms of wrangling that material together. We'd, of course, have to do some prep.
Right.
Because things like long PDFs, that may or may not be the venue for, read a lot of this scholarship and then collect it together. But certainly something like those links.
Yeah.
Because those are, a minute or two, most of them. Sort through these links, try and categorize them or something like that. That might be something we could float and see how that shakes out.
Yeah. Yeah. If anything, just to familiarize ourselves with the process of doing it. I mean, like you
Right.
said, I think just experientially, either setting up these hits or also doing these hits. So theoretically, I could be doing them. I've been approved.
Right.
So, but yeah, I think there's a benefit of doing that. Just to see how it shakes out, and maybe even starting with those articles, right? Organize these articles. Here is a penny a task to organize these articles about how Mechanical Turks is exploiting your labor.
That's interesting. That would be interesting because, you would think, well, is Amazon going to allow content that is essentially bashing it? But almost, you'd think, is there any way for them to, because Mechanical Turk is like a fire hose.
Right.
Unless they have, algorithms that are proofing those materials, it's not like there's someone sitting there approving it. But maybe there is. Maybe a Mechanical Turk is set up to approve hits. I mean, yeah. I'm not quite sure.
There's a bot that just spots the word exploitative and flags it.
Even that would be an interesting, if a job gets rejected, why? And that may help us.
That would be really right. Could we actually, this might actually be a separate experiment, right? That we kind of want this to happen, but could we say generate 10 hits of various levels of what we think are complexity, and see how many of them get flagged or taken, how many of them get completed. I mean, I wonder if someone's even tried this, right? We actually just put up we put up Beowulf and asked for people to give us a summary of it, right? Is that something Turks? I don't know. I'm just wildly speculating.
Well, and there is the good news is there is literature about using mechanical Turks in an academic context, which means there's material about how to do that. So it's going to, some of it will discuss, let me see here. Those kind of things of what's a good job, what's a job that's going to get completed. Of course, I was looking at this, so it's readily available.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a book, and there are, of course, just articles. Most of the articles tend to be, more discipline specific, and as we've encountered, there's not a whole lot in rhetoric studies specifically about mechanical Turk, but in other fields, there is a literature about, okay, so how do you set up a proper Turk job?
Right.
And potentially that might give us the edges of, okay, so what happens when you push those parameters a little bit? Where does it break down and why?
Yeah.
And that may help us trace out, okay, so then what is, if we're looking at what is human in human intelligence tasks, those cusp failures are probably more informative than, one that's blanketly accepted, that you don't exactly know why, right?
Right. Yeah.
Or where the edges are, even if you don't know why.
Yeah, no, in particular, I think given how we're approaching this, that it may be that the why is sort of constantly deferred.
Right.
That in many ways that whatever why we get across, right? I mean, this is sort of now moving back into kind of at least what I imagine as the other thing that's potentially informing our method is the kind of actor network approach, right? The why would be a rush to explain, where it may be that what we generate is just enough description that we get a sense of where it's at.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why I like the sort of that Amazon calls this mechanical Turk, but the more I've been reading about the mechanical Turk, I mean, the way in which it's really interesting as a kind of conceptual, right? That it's a technique that's useful for generating these concepts is the way in which, because it's an illusion, right? The way in which it attempts to mask human agency that requires machine agency and human agency to mask its, right? So what's interesting about the mechanical Turk is that it's not as you read some of these historical accounts, right? It's not an automaton as people imagined them at that point. But there's a weird sense in which it's obviously not reducible to the person inside that was playing chess. And that every attempt to hide the fact that there was a person playing chess necessitated the invention of more machinic techniques to hide that. Right. Which means that by the end of the day, the mechanical Turk is approaching something like an automaton, right? That there actually are some of the machine parts were just fake, designed to make it look like a machine part. But there were actually sophisticated mechanisms that allowed it to work. And part of what I like about it too is it's the way that right, if we want to be able to sort out or not, right, human agency from non-human agency, and that binary itself already potentially being trouble, right? The idea that there's such a thing as human agency that's separate from whatever, right? But it's a cabinet that's designed to hide all of that. So there's this interesting kind of dissimulation of agency that goes into that cabinet, and that whatever attribution of agency that you end up developing, you've developed by virtue of the ways in which that cabinet is both revealing and concealing what it's doing. So there's no way to abstract whatever concept you'd have of human agency out of the mechanical Turk, because the mechanical Turk is always obfuscating what it's doing. Yeah.
And even the notions of things like deception, of course, I mean, they presume, well, this is the right way to view it and the way that we're distracting from that or whatever, right? I mean, deception presumes there's a reality there, but what is it really? And of course, there's a presumption. I mean, from another perspective, you would say, well, the machine isn't a lie. The machine's the machine. Right. I mean, the machine is doing what the machine does. It's the same sort of thing when people commonly refer to things as broken, right? I mean, there was, the book Reality is Broken. This website is broken. It's like, well, no, it's doing what it does. Right. Broken is the parameters we're assigning. Well, this is what I feel it should be doing, and it is not doing that. I mean, it's not it that's broken. It's in a lot of ways, it's the perception that is assigning brokenness or deception, right? Yeah.
No, this is what's interesting about glitch and the ways in which glitch art works, right? I have my students do it where you take a JPEG and you open it up in TextEdit, and TextEdit turns it into text because that's what it does. And then you delete all of the M's or the ampersands, and then you save it back out as a JPEG file, and you get an image that's now been glitched or broken. But of course, what's interesting is that really nothing is broken, right? TextEdit's doing what TextEdit does irrepressibly, right? It can't help itself. And the JPEG is a file type that's able to be rendered that way, right? So it creates what looks like this broken, glitched image. But at no point in that process has anything done anything other than what it does.
Right.
Yeah.
And so in terms of moving forward, I mean, one thing that I haven't mentioned is I'm going to be at Computers and Writing this week, where I'm going to talk about this and hopefully get people to look at things like, do they want to participate? Because that's something we're hammering out. I mean, we talked last time about initially doing things like targeting people we know in order to provide insight into the concepts that or practices, whatever we're dealing with at the time.
Yeah.
So initially we'd be sort of targeting people with the hope that we may be getting guests who, eventually aren't ones that we know and would seek out, right? I mean, ideally, we'll be able to get in guests who have, different perspectives, even potentially adversarial ones in the production process, rather than, once a draft is finished, sort of conventional peer review of, well, we finished a draft, now please look at it and tell me, where I'm morally bankrupt.
Right. Tell me where I'm morally bankrupt now.
Right. The idea is to incorporate the perspectives as we go. And there is sort of a weird, I don't know if it's a catch-22, but, they're unknown unknowns. We don't know who we don't know.
Right.
So there's a sort of a weird hook of, how are we going to get people unless they come across the work and are interested, or, we can potentially try and find people to suggest other folks to us. Although even there, it's sort of like it's just a remove. It's kind of a
right. How many degrees of separation can we get that way?
Right. So that's one thing I'll be doing at Computers and Writing is hopefully trying to get ideas in that direction. So that's one thing that's going on there. We'll want to look into, as far as I can see, potentially talking with Jeff about the manifold installation. I mean, It looks like, if it's the university's installation, that may be difficult. But if those, who knows? I mean, if they're running separate installs, it may not be a big deal. I don't know,
Yeah, and the sense I got is the updates can happen on a pretty localized level, I guess. But again, that depends on how Kentucky's got it set up.
Right. And then we'll want to think about, if we want to, since we've got all this accumulated material, if we want to wade into at least partially, sorting it out by using the Turk itself, that might be more grist for the mill.
Yeah. But yeah, I think probably making a push to get people to talk to, I think, at this point. At least, and maybe even concurrently, or because I think at this point it feels like we kind of have at least a basic conceptual approach. And so it might be interesting to bring in people that would talk about, cultural techniques or actor network theory. I know there's people in like computational rhetoric that they're not quite doing mechanical Turk stuff, but they might have some interest there. So, maybe even bringing in guests that are at least bring them in according to particular conversations or discourses that we're speaking to, and then bring them in almost as not representatives, but as that's kind of their area, and then have them kind of speak to the project in those terms.
Yeah, if not experts, at least people who are conversant or looking at these issues, experienced, right?
Yeah.
I mean, have a perspective to contribute, and we'll see where that goes, right? I mean, because potentially we can find someone with a very different perspective that we haven't considered, even if it's not on this particular material, if it's has to do with approaches or something like that.
Right.
So yeah, we'd want to line up, a guest, which would, as I mentioned, we'll need to, I think, hammer out a dedicated regular meeting time. Yeah. And if it's the case that a guest can't meet at that time, we can just accommodate that guest. But, as Jeff pointed out, you sort of need momentum, right? You need regular meetings in order to make sure you're progressing forward in order to do that. So we can hammer that out, and then ultimately we can do something like post that on the Manifold site. And in fact, if we can use that block one, potentially just have at the top a text block that indicates this is when the usual session is. Here's the link to it, which would change but would be easy to update. So
yeah, no, I think that works. And are we thinking every 2 weeks?
I think so. A fortnight.
A fortnight, yes.
I think so. I mean, I think that would be good. Since like all academics, we're working on a lot of stuff. A week is probably possible, but probably unnecessary. I think we'd be kind of covering the same ground, having the same conversations quite a bit. I think every 2 weeks is probably appropriate, but we can adjust that if we need to.
But I think that makes sense as a starting point, and that will sort of keep us close to it too.
Right. Yeah.
And it'll also help us plan out if we as we start thinking about when we're going to have people on. If we know it's going to be every 2 weeks, then we can get a sense of how many people we can accommodate, or if we want to do bonus episodes. If we get an embarrassment of riches.
Okay, so that looks. What I've got is so we'd want to touch base with the publisher about upgrading Manifold. We'll want to think about floating maybe a classification job on Mechanical Turk, and then potentially from there, I just sort of added a note about if that works out, we can even consider working that into sort of the method of complicating those jobs to see where they break down, or just to see which ones break down. Even if we can't explain, we can find the edges.
And that's what I think will be interesting too. I mean, because if that's the approach that we take, there's going to be a certain amount of volume that will be necessary.
Yeah.
For us to kind of be able to discern anything.
Well, and the method as we have written up, we're essentially doing content analysis. So, I mean, one way to think of this is just as one portion of the content analysis. If we look at a lot of other jobs and we're able to pull themes out of that in terms of how's human labor being described here or whatever. And as I've pointed out before, I'm going to a training workshop about using machine learning for textual content analysis in July. So hopefully I'll be able to pick up some useful techniques there. It's a ICPSR workshop. Potentially then we can also see our work as part of the content analysis in terms of here's the language of our posts, right?
Oh, interesting.
You see what I'm saying? And then because in a real way, the body of these things is text. It's one reason why this is such a neat rhetorical artifact is because largely you're communicating these things through text and other forms of media. But I mean, it's you know, it's sort of a just hardcore rhetorical situation. It's like I've got this text, this potentially multimedia text that has to do particular things, persuade and, you know, communicate and articulate, right?
Right.
So potentially we can use a content analysis method both for jobs that are on MTurk, but then also jobs we construct.
Yeah. Yeah, it'd be interesting too is if at some point if we've got enough texts from just existing hits, is there a hit we could generate that would, I mean, almost just a hit that's just a grab bag of all the key terms
that leverages what we find.
Right.
Yeah, potentially.
But yeah, then what will be interesting is this the shape that it takes, right? Over so many human intelligence tasks. What is human intelligence?
Yeah. And
how is this particular community, which includes, you know, a mix of different kinds of actants, how is it composing human intelligence?
Yeah. And so potentially the first foray into that is, you know, a sample job. We'll have to probably do a little bit of reading up in terms of, and I've got some resources there linked, of how to compose these, you know, what's an effective one. Even some of those materials look at things like how do you price it? Right?
Yeah.
So that's one thing, targeting folks to bring in as guests. A lot of these things are preliminary, right? We need to do some things in order to hopefully branch them out. We need to target a few guests, hopefully then branching out to people that we wouldn't anticipate.
Yeah.
And then last I've got, this is perhaps the easiest, just hammer out a regular meeting time. And right now we're both sort of in summer session stuff. If that needs to change in the fall, that can happen. I mean, you know, everyone's on an academic timetable, so. But hammer that out and then post it and make it publicly available.
Okay.
That's what I've got. Am I overlooking anything?
I think that's it.
Okay. All right, so we can do that stuff, and then we'll meet again. By next time, I mean, I'll have some information about. I'll have been to Computers and Writing and back, so I'll have
maybe we can do part of our conversation. Can maybe just be a debrief.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's what I've got. Anything else?
No.
Okay. So we'll work on those tasks, and then we'll, as you say, we'll debrief after Computers and Writing, and make progress on those other things.
Okay.
All right. I will talk to you later.
All right.
See ya.
Bye.